Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and today we're tier ranking all the new retro artifacts from the Brothers War for Magic Arena. So we got a lot of cards to talk about, which means we should probably jump right into it. Before we do, a quick reminder, if you need some retro artifacts of your own, you can get them from our awesome sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish, and even get a free goldfish sticker. Anyway, let's tier rank the retro artifacts from the Brothers War. Alright, it is time to tier rank the retro artifacts from the Brothers War, and this is going to be a big job. There are a lot of these retro artifacts. So here is a couple of quick notes before we start ranking cards. First off, our focus today is Magic Arena formats. Being reprinted as a retro artifact in the Brothers War doesn't actually change which format these cards are legal in. So if a card was legal in Modern before it was reprinted, it's still legal in Modern. If it wasn't legal in Modern before this reprinting, it's still not legal in Modern. But the exception to this is Arena formats. Many of these cards are new to Arena for the first time, which means our focus today is going to be on Historic Brawl, and Explorer, which sadly didn't get a ton from this set, but there are a couple of cards that are relevant for Explorer. So those are our formats of the day that we're going to be focusing on. Because that's 3 formats, might be a little bit messy. Like, what do you do with a card that's really good in Historic Brawl, but no potential in Historic, not legal in Explorer? But we'll talk about that as we go along. As far as the tiers, S is like the best cards in the set. These ones are definitely going to show up, maybe, hopefully, in multiple formats. A tier cards, you're probably going to see them, probably just in one format. B tier is kind of average. They're cards that I think you can see play in niche archetypes. Like, in the right deck, it could be good, but in general, not very good. C is a little bit worse than B. It's not impossible that some deck somewhere would want them, but even in that deck, it's kind of going to be a filler card. And then D is the worst cards from the set. And you see this NA down here. That is for cards that already exist on Arena. Something like Aetherflux Reservoir. It already exists on Arena. It is exactly as good today as it was a month ago. Nothing really changes, except now you can get a really pretty version of it with an old border. So anyway, with that stuff out of the way, let's see if we can tier rank these cards. We'll leave Aetherflux Reservoir in the NA category for cards that already exist on Arena. First up, Adaptive Automaton. This is a 3-mana 2/2 Lord. But its upside is it's a Lord for any tribe. So the problem with this card, which I think I'm going to put in the C tier, is filler even in its best possible home. So the problem with the card is it's just overcosted. 3-mana Lords aren't good, especially ones that don't really have a big upside. However, I do think this card can show up in a very specific context, which is I think that it can show up in Historic Brawl tribal decks for janky tribes that don't have a lot of tribe members. If you're trying to build Squirrel Tribal and there's only 10 squirrels on Arena, this probably makes the cut as squirrel number 11, even though it's not exciting, even though it's not good. But the fact it turns into the tribe of your choice, that does have some value in just filling out janky tribal decks that are lacking tribe members. Next up, we have infamous modern combo piece, Altar of Dementia. Altar of Dementia is really interesting. We've seen this card be kind of broken in Modern. It was part of the Hogak deck that ended up getting banned. We've played persist combos with it where this is a big payoff. If you can have a way to have a creature that is infinitely sacrificable, that keeps coming into play somehow, this just lets you mill out your opponent all in one shot. And we do have some of these combos on Arena, unfortunately not very good ones, but like Dualcaster Mage and Ascent from Avernus gives you infinite milling and keep copying the Ascent from Avernus to reanimate the Dualcaster Mage. Maybe the easiest is Putrid Golem Solemnity. You have the persist creature that you can keep sacrificing and it comes back into play, doesn't get the counter because of Solemnity. Unfortunately, all those combos are kind of lacking in redundancy. Like Putrid Goblin's the only persist creature currently on Arena. Solemnity is the only Solemnity effect. There's no Malai or Anafenza to work as a backup. So I think for now, Altar has to be a B. There's enough pieces to build a Sweet Against Odds deck around it, although at the same time, I don't know if there's enough pieces to really build a competitive Altar of Dementia deck at this point. However, as we've seen in Modern, this is a card that can definitely shoot up the rankings. As we get more cards on Arena, I would not be surprised if this is A tier, even S tier, maybe even good enough to support a ban-worthy deck. So it's a card to keep in mind as new sets release, as we get more persist creatures and combo pieces, this could end up being very, very scary and very good because it's just 2 mana, so it's very efficient for a combo piece. But right now, the combos I found mostly look like against the odds combos to me rather than competitive combos. Speaking of combos, next up, we have one of the most infamous combo pieces, maybe in Magic's history, Ashnod's Altar, mostly known for going infinite in Commander, where you sack a creature for 2 mana and then you have a way to infinitely sacrifice creatures. In some ways, it's kind of similar to Altar of Dementia, except you make infinite mana rather than mill your opponent out. Altar of Dementia, it's another card that I don't know if we have enough pieces to really make it great right now. It might be an against the odds card. A lot of those same loops we were just talking about, Putrid Golem and Solemnity, they get you partway there. The problem with Ashnod's Altar is it only makes colorless mana. So I think the easiest way to go infinite with Ashnod's Altar on Arena is actually Pitiless Plunder. If you have like Pitiless Plunder Resembling Skeleton, you can sacrifice your skeleton. Your Pitiless Plunder is going to make the treasure for the colored mana. Then you can use the colorless mana for your Resembling Skeleton, put it back into play and sack it to Ashnod's Altar, and then you make infinite mana and win the game somehow. So there are combos, much like Altar of Dementia. I feel like this is a combo piece that currently doesn't have top tier historic combos available. I think that it'll get better as we get more cards. I would not be surprised if this was a very scary S tier, maybe even ban worthy card eventually. For now, we're going to put it in A tier for one reason. It's ranked ahead of Altar Dementia just because I think sacrifice decks will play it. If you're playing like Corvald in Historic Brawl, you can play this just as a sack outlet / ramp piece. So I think it has more uses than Altar of Dementia, which is pretty much an all-in combo piece. You can play Ashnod's Altar like semi-fairly in a format like Historic Brawl. So another wait and see card. If you can come up with easier infinite combos that are just like 2 pieces or more consistent, I think it gets even better. But for now, it's another one of those broken combo pieces that probably could use more support to really make it in 60 card formats. We also got Astral Cornucopia, so a 3 mana rock with the flexibility of being a triple X spell. So if you got 6 mana, you can put an extra counter on it. This is a card that we've mostly seen see play in like Dice-Tron decks in Modern, decks that can add charge counters to it in some way other than paying its mana cost. Sadly, we don't have any of those pieces right now on Magic Arena, so I think this is just a bad mana rock. However, that could change in the future because there's been rumors and leaks that suggest maybe proliferate's coming back in Phyrexia in a couple of months. So if we get a bunch of new powerful proliferate cards, that gets a lot better. So for now, we're going to put it in the C tier. I think you can play it as a mana rock in Historic Brawl, it's fine. If you got proliferate synergy, it goes up in value. But this could end up being an even better mana rock in Historic Brawl if we get a good proliferate commander. Blackblade Reforged, NA, already on Arena. Bonesaw is kind of a funny one. Bonesaw is 0 mana equipment. It hardly does anything. Gives the creature +1/+0. The only place this really sees play is in combo decks. We've seen in the past like Pure Steel Paladin with Paradoxical Outcome decks that are using this just as a 0 mana artifact. You almost never want to equip it. Right now we don't have Pure Steel Paladin on the client. We do have like Sram and Mira, so maybe there's some sort of combo there. I'm going to put this in the C tier. I wouldn't say it's completely unplayable, but you really need to be a deck that can somehow abuse a 0 mana artifact. You don't play this as an equipment. You're not trying to put it on your creature and go your creature. This is just a Darksteel Relic, essentially. A 0 mana artifact. If your deck can abuse having a 0 mana artifact, then this is fine, just because there's not that many 0 mana artifacts. But I don't know if we have all the pieces to really make like that Pure Steel Storm combo deck work on Arena in Historic just yet. We also got Burnished Chart, which I'm going to put this in the A tier. Burnished Chart is one of the best ramp cards in non-green commander decks. It's kind of a commander staple. Just, yeah, it's expensive, 3 mana and 3 to activate, but you get to search 2 lands onto the battlefield, basic lands. So this is a card that allows your non-green deck to land ramp, not as well as green decks, but pretty well. One of the best non-green land ramp cards that we have access to. Never been on Arena before, not gonna have any potential in 60 card formats, but if you're playing a non-green Historic Brawl deck, I think this is at least in the conversation as one of the ramp spells in your deck. Cage Sun, this one's even tougher. Cage Sun, no potential in Historic itself, I don't think, but doubling your mana, potentially growing your creatures, but only for 1 color, does have relevance in commander decks and in Historic Brawl decks. I think I'm going to go with B on this one. Unlike Burnished Chart, which can show up in a 2-color or even a 3-color non-green deck, Cage Sun is almost exclusively for monocolor decks. So if you're a monocolor Historic Brawl deck and you want some ramping, it's a very powerful effect. I think I would play it in monocolor Historic Brawl decks a high percentage of the time, but outside of those decks, it's relatively useless. Chromatic Lantern, NA, that one's already on Arena. Chromatic Star, this one's kind of interesting. We have Chromatic Sphere already on Arena, so now we got Chromatic Star. We have seen these cards join together in egg-style combo decks in Modern Tron, and we even see Chromatic Sphere that is already on Arena show up in some artifact-based decks already, so I think this just gives more consistency to those decks. Maybe with some of these new cards, we can have an egg-style combo deck. Not that I want that, that would probably be miserable, but having all 8 of the Chromatic Sphere and Star cards on Arena, that is relevant. It adds a lot of consistency and card draw to your colorless decks, good way to filter through the deck. So I'm going to put it in the A tier. If you were already playing Chromatic Sphere somewhere, this is arguably just better because of how its card draw triggers, and I think we'll see decks that are playing both of them together in the same show. We also got Cloud Key. Cloud Key, mostly a combo piece. You get to choose a card type and reduce the cost of that card type by 1. Normally not good enough to play for value, but if you're trying to, let's say, reduce the cost of your Chromatic Stars and Chromatic Spheres to 0, so they turn into free card draw spells, then it's very, very good at that. So I'm going to put this in the B tier. I think there could be some sort of artifact egg-style combo deck with the Chromatic Spheres and Chromatic Stars that can take advantage of it. I'm just not sure what the payoffs for those decks are. We don't have like the Faith Reward effects. There's no Carrot Clan Ironworks. So I'm not sure what the payoff is for doing this, but if someone can figure it out, it could actually be a very obnoxious historic deck to play against. Next up, we got Defense Grid, and this one is, I think, kind of the epitome of B tier. It's a card that is very good at its job. A 2-mana artifact that makes spells cast during your opponent's turn cost 3 more. It's a really good way to hate on the counterspell heavy control decks. If you're playing against a Crim deck who's just always leaving up mana, always countering your stuff, and you have a specific finisher or combo you're trying to resolve, then this is a really nice combo piece. You bring it in, you sneak it down early before your opponent can counter it, and then when you go for your big turn and try to combo off, it's going to be really hard for your opponent to be able to counter your spells because of the attacks, but that's really all it does. So I don't think you see this in the main deck, but as counter hate in combo decks out of the sideboard, I think it has some relevance. We also got probably the best against the odds card from the set, which is Door to Nothingness. Oh, it really pains me, but as far as competitive play, I think this card is sadly a D. That said, it is one of my favorite cards to build around from the set. Just making a player lose the game for a ton of mana. I mean, it's double Wurtburg, and you got to get down the artifact, and you got to wait for it to untap, but it is a hilarious way to win the game. So this isn't a competitive card, but I'm sure we will have an against odds around it, and it could be a fun janky finish in your 5-color Historic Brawl deck. It's not a good way to finish the game, but it is a hilarious finish the quest, achieve the goal style win condition. Elsewhere Flask, it's a 2-mana artifact that cantrips. There are decks that want that. It doesn't do a whole lot. It kind of can fix your mana. Mostly an eggs combo style piece, but I don't know, maybe Doom Foretold or something will want it. Tempted to put it in B, but let's drop it to C just because we have a bunch of these 2-mana ETB draw card artifacts now, and I don't know if there's enough room for all of them, so this might not make the cut. Foundry Inspector, already on Arena. Gilded Lotus, also already on Arena. Goblin Charbelcher, oh, this is a hard one to rank. So this is a constructed card. This is one of the decks I want to build the most for competitive Historic. It is a great combo piece. We see it be competitive in Legacy. We see it be competitive in Modern. So the good news is we got all the MDFCs, which is one of the best ways to make Belcher work. So we have the ability to play a deck that essentially has 0 lands, which is one of the big asks of Goblin Charbelcher. We also have Iron Crag Feet, which is one of the best ways to get to 7 mana, which is how much it costs to cast and then activate Belcher in the same turn. So that's the good news. Those pieces exist. The bad news is we are missing early game rituals. Pyretic Ritual, Desperate Ritual, those are on Arena. And the other big combo piece is Recross Path, that is like the super tutor that lets you stack the deck. I'm going to put Belcher, oh geez, I'm going to put it as an A. I might be overrating it, but I think there are enough pieces that exist that you can build a real Charbelcher deck in Historic that'll win a decent amount of games. Not going to be as good as the Modern or Legacy versions, but I think that it will be good enough that it can be at least semi-competitive, like a tier 2, tier 3 deck in Historic. Helm of the Host, already on Arena. Howling Mine, Turbo Fog piece, card draw each turn. The only thing I'll say about this, and I'm going to put it in the C tier, we haven't really seen this card be good in 60 card formats in quite a long time, so I don't think it's really going to make it in Historic. You could try to build Turbo Fog, but there's so much hate for Turbo Fog now because of Bone Crushers and Questing Beasts that it's just an archetype that doesn't really work well anymore. But I could see this seeing play in like Mira decks in Historic Brawl, like because it only works if it's untapped. If you have an easy way to tap this where you're drawing the card but your opponent doesn't get to draw the card, it goes way up in value. So I could see people playing it in Mirror in specific, but outside of that, I'm not really sure where it goes. Ichor Wellspring, Ardeon Arena, Inspiring Statuary, Ardeon Arena, Ivory Tower. Little fun fact on this one, this card was actually banned in the early years of Magic because apparently gaining like 2 or 3 life a turn was just too overpowered because creatures were so bad. But we're not playing the early days of Magic. This is 2022. Gaining a couple of life each turn is just, it's not relevant anymore. This card, it's clearly a D tier. This card is completely unplayable. I don't think there's any uses for it. Yeah, I could see some argument that it's good in Soul Sisters, but even in Soul Sisters, a deck that cares about life gain, I think there's just easier ways to get the job done. Janum Tome, it's jank. It's just too expensive to make it work. Journeyer's Kite. This card's interesting. So Journeyer's Kite in the early days of Commander was actually a pretty decent card. It was arguably like a staple 10 years ago at Commander. However, since then we got Thematic Compass, which is almost just a strictly better version of Journeyer's Kite, and that does exist on Arena. So if you want another Thematic Compass for some reason in your Historic Brawl deck, you can play Journeyer's Kite, but really, most decks don't want that effect anyway, and if you do want that effect, you're going to go with Thematic Compass. So I think this is mostly just a D tier card. Would have been exciting a decade ago, but in 2022, not really getting there. We also got Keening Stone, which can mill a lot of cards, but my god, does it cost a lot of mana. 6 to cast, 5 to activate, which means it basically has no potential in 60 card formats. If you're playing a mill Historic Brawl deck, I could see throwing this in for fun. I guess that makes it like a C tier. I don't think it'll necessarily be good in a mill Historic Brawl deck, but you could play it there and it's probably good enough that you're not going to be like sad to have it in your deck. So I don't think it's a great card, but in that very narrow set of circumstances, I guess it could work. Key to the City, Ardeon Arena. Oh, Liquid Metal Coating. I actually cannot believe they put this card on Arena. This is our first S tier card. So why is Liquid Metal Coating an S tier? The answer is, if you play Modern, you know what this card can do. It interacts absurdly well with Karn the Great Creator, with the idea being you tutor Liquid Metal Coating out of your sideboard, and then use it to turn your opponent's lands into artifacts, and then you uptick your Karn to turn the land into a 0/0 creature so it dies. So essentially, Karn grabbing this just lets you blow up one of your opponent's lands every single turn, and then you get additional upside, where all of a sudden your Braids turn into instant speed Vindicate. Anything that says destroy an artifact, Mari command can blow up any permanent. So I think this card is definitely part of the Karn board. We're going to see people getting locked out of the game with this and Karn, just like we see in Modern, and it could be worth building around. Like, play 4 copies, play a bunch of artifact destruction. That's probably more the against the odds way to play it, but it still is a really funny archetype to be able to turn on all this artifact destruction and blow up all your opponent's stuff because of its ramifications in Historic and specific with Karn the Great Creator. I think this card is clearly S tier, to the point where I think we're going to see complaints about this card. I would not be surprised if, because of Brothers War, we see Karn get banned in multiple formats. And if Wizards doesn't want to ban Karn, I think Liquid Metal Coating is probably the way to go. Next up, we have Lodestone Golem. Oh, this card's a classic. 4-mana artifact, decent stats as a 5/3, and then it taxes non-artifact spells, +1/+0. So this is kind of like a big Thalia for your artifact deck. The question's going to be, where does this fit? So we already have affinity style decks in Historic. I think it's going to be very good there. We also have Thorn of Amethyst, which we haven't gotten to yet, but that's another artifact taxing piece. So maybe we can see some sort of like artifact prison stack style deck develop in Historic. I'm going to put Lodestone Golem as a B, I think. I think in that very specific deck, in a fully artifact deck, it can be a good hate card against combo style decks. And in some sort of stack, it's a very, very good finisher. Do we have enough pieces to make a Historic version of artifact decks work? That's what we got to wait and see. So for now, it's a B tier, but keep this one in mind because it has been playable in older formats in the past. We also got Mesmeric Orb. Mesmeric Orb, one of the best modern mill cards. Just whenever a permanent opponent becomes untapped, that player gets milled. So this can end up milling a lot of cards each turn. If you have 5 or 10 permanents untapping, that's a lot of cards getting milled. So this is a staple in modern mill decks, and I think this will be a staple in historic mill decks as well. Historic mill, definitely like a tier 3 style archetype. It's not breaking the format, but there are a lot of pieces. They keep adding more pieces for it. So I think this is probably an A tier card. It goes into a lower tier deck, but it's going to be one of the best cards in that deck. Plus, you can play it in your mill historic brawl decks as well. On the other end, Millstone, it's already on Arena, but don't play that in your mill decks. Mind's Eye, this is another Journeyer's Guide. This is a card that was exciting in Commander a decade ago, but is just not really useful anymore. And remember, we don't have Commander on Magic Arena. We have Historic Brawl, which is a 1v1 style Commander format. In Mind's Eye, since it triggers whenever an opponent draws a card, it goes down in value a lot in 1v1 formats. In real Commander, you have 3 opponents that are drawing at least 3 cards each turn. So every turn cycle, you get to draw a bunch of cards. In Historic Brawl, you have 1 opponent drawing 1 card each turn unless they have extra card draw. Just not enough attached to a 5-mana artifact. So no 60 card potential, and honestly, probably no Historic Brawl potential either. Mishra's Bauble, this one's going in the NA pile for a different reason though. It's not already on Arena, but it's already been banned on Arena in Historic, and I think that was a good choice. This is a card that I would like to see banned in Modern. Free spells just lead to problems. This is a free way to trigger prowess. It reduces the size of your deck because it's free card draw. It is just kind of a miserable card. So I'm glad they preemptively banned this one. This was the only card from the set that they preemptively banned, unlike the Strixhaven Mystical Archives, which actually had a lot of bad eggs. So going in the NA pile because it's not legal anywhere, you can throw it into your Historic Brawl deck, although, I don't know, maybe if you're playing Emery or some other like recur artifact Historic Brawl deck, Mira that just cares about non-token artifacts, then I could see including this. It is relatively free because it draws a card and doesn't really cost you anything. But outside of those scenarios, I don't think it really does much of anything. Mox Amber, already on Arena. Mystical Pizza Oven, already on Arena. Ornithopter, already on Arena. Perilous Vault, already on Arena. Phyrexian Processor, this card's hilarious. The upside of Phyrexian Processor is you can essentially set your life total to anything you want. So for 4 mana, you can choose to pay 19 life and go to 1 life. So if you're playing a deck that is trying to switch life totals, like that weird deck that Phil played a while ago, if you're playing a weird janky brew of Death Shadow and you just want to get your life total as low as possible, then it's pretty good. Outside of life switching or Death Shadow shenanigans though, it's 4 to cast and then it's 4 to make a token. And if you're against aggro and take a bunch of damage, that token's not even going to be very big. So it's not a card you can really play fairly. I'm going to stick it in the C tier, I guess. I wouldn't say it's like completely unplayable just because of the potential of those life loss shenanigan decks, but don't just run this deck for value. You're going to end up disappointed. Phyrexian Revoker. This card actually has me excited. You might have noticed so far, we have talked almost exclusively about Historic and Historic Brawl. That's because I don't think any of these cards are actually going to be legal in Explorer, or at least new to Explorer. So our first Explorer card is Phyrexian Revoker, and this is the card that kind of matters. This card does see play in Pioneer. It's essentially a Pithing Needle on a 2-mana, 2/1 artifact body. So it shows up in 2 scenarios. One is it shows up as a Pithing Needle in decks that have creature synergy. So if you have a collected company, this is a Pithing Needle that you can Coco into. It also sometimes shows up as a Pithing Needle in like Karn decks. We were talking about the Karn board with liquid metal coating. Our Phyrexian Revoker can work there as well. Also could be a good piece in the stack decks we were talking about, like Lodestone Golem, Phyrexian Revoker. Just play all these artifacts that make your opponent's life miserable. So this could be a piece of that. So I'm mostly hyped that this is actually a card that's legal in Explorer and is at least somewhat relevant to the Pioneer format. So I'm going to put it in the A tier. I do think this is a sideboard card, but it's a sideboard card that I think will show up in Historic and also in Explorer. Platinum Angel, that is already on Arena. Precursor Golem is an interesting card. So for 5 mana, you get 3/3/3. So 9 power and toughness, which even in 2022 is pretty far above the curve. The problem is when Golem is targeted, that spell is copied for all your other Golems. So that means a single removal spell can clean up all the Golems, which means traditionally this card isn't super playable. Maybe in an artifact deck like the Lodestone deck, in the right matchup, it could be okay. It could be very fun fun in like a Zada Historic Brawl deck or some other deck that cares about targeting your own creatures with spells to copy them. The problem is we don't have Zada on Arena yet, so I'm not sure what deck you'd want this in. So I'm going to put this in the C tier. Keep it in mind for the future, but right now, the upside of putting a lot of power and toughness on the battlefield just isn't really enough to make up for the fact that all of your golems die to a removal spell. We also got Pristine Talisman, which is a very B-style card. It's a 3-mana mana rock. When you tap it, you get to gain a life. If you're playing Historic Brawl, and you have some life gain synergies, this is a mana rock that's worth considering for your deck. Outside of that, there's probably better options. Speaking of Historic Brawl, we also got Psychosis Crawler, which is a relatively popular commander card for wheel style decks. If you are able to draw a lot of cards and churn through the deck, this can actually add up to a lot of damage and be a pretty big body. We don't have as many wheels on Arena, although we do have commanders that care about this. Like, this is a great addition to a Sheoldred the Apocalypse Historic Brawl deck. So I expect that in those decks, we're going to see Psychosis Crawler show up quite a bit in Historic Brawl. A little bit too expensive for 60 card formats, though. We also got Quicksilver Amulet. Quicksilver Amulet, 4 mana to cast, 4 to activate, lets you put a creature into play from your hand. An exciting effect. If you want to try to dump huge dinosaurs or huge artifact finishers into play from your hand, this does get the job done. However, we got Monster Manual for green decks. We have Thran Temporal Gateway, which kind of does the same thing for historic cards, so for legends or planeswalkers. So I'm not sure that this is the best version of the effect anymore. So I think that there's a rule for this. If you're playing a Historic Brawl deck, or even like a historic deck, whose goal is to slam big Eldrazi into play, slam some of the new big artifact creatures into play from the Brothers War, I can see throwing this in the deck. Just keep in mind, there are a bunch of other cards now that do something similar, and depending on the exact build of your deck, they might just be better than Quicksilver Amulet. So we're gonna go in the B tier for now, I guess. We also got Quietus Spikes. Fine equipment if you're playing an equipment-based Historic Brawl deck. A little too expensive and a little too conditional. You got to get in hits with it to make your opponent lose half their life total. A little too conditional for 60-card format, so worth keeping in mind, especially in Historic Brawl where we don't have all the swords yet. Some of the most stapley equipment from Commander just don't exist. So worth keeping in mind for your equipment Historic Brawl deck, but probably more of like a filler equipment than a real staple. We also got Ramos Dragon's Engine. And this card, I think, is going to be the most popular Historic Brawl commander from the set. Ramos, pretty popular in Commander proper, and there's even less competition on Magic Arena. So if you want to build a 5-color, multicolor theme deck, this is a really, really sweet commander. I'm going to put it in the A tier. I would be surprised to see it show up much outside of Historic Brawl. It's 6 mana. You got to cast spells to get value out of it, so it doesn't really do anything right away, which doesn't exactly seem playable in a format like Historic. Although I did have someone send me a deck that was looking to reanimate Ramos and also reanimate Door to Nothingness and use a Ramos mana to activate Door to Nothingness, which seemed really fun. So maybe it could be at least a good against the odds card. Maybe you could play it in 5-color Niv in Historic. But for now, it's going to go in the A tier. Is one of the most exciting new commanders from the set for Historic Brawl. We also got Rune Chanter Spike. So Rune Chanter Spike, a decade ago, was a standard staple. This was in the best version of the Delver deck in the original Innistrad standard. It can just make a creature huge. If you're playing some sort of Haughty Djinn style deck where you're just filling your graveyard with spells, for 2 to cast and 2 to equip, this can give a creature a ridiculous amount of power. It's basically a Haughty Djinn that you can move around on your creatures. The question is, do decks need this anymore? Is this still a playable card in 2022? Hasn't shown up in Modern in a long time. Maybe that changes in Historic. Maybe the format's small enough to make it work. Not legal in Explorer, unfortunately. I'm going to put this in the C tier. I don't think it's necessary anymore. The downside of the card is it wants to go in a spell deck, and it itself is not a spell, and it is not a creature, so you need a creature, and that's just a big ask. If you look at your spell slinger decks, like a Haughty Djinn deck, you usually have like, what, 12-ish creatures, and then a ton of spells, because you need the spells to grow your creatures and support your creatures. Is there room to put an artifact that isn't either of those things in a deck like that? So I think it's worth keeping in mind, just because there are tons of spell in the graveyard decks. It is very, very easy to fill your graveyard with spells in Historic, and then you throw this on an evasive creature and go to town, but my guess is it doesn't quite make the cut. We also got Scrap Trawler, already on Arena. Sculpting Steel, 3 mana, artifact clone, essentially. You can copy any artifact when it comes into play. We've gotten way more clones lately, and way more flexible clones that can target more than just creatures. So Sculpting Steel is a card that has consistently gone down in value, I would say, for commander decks, just because there's so many more options. However, if you are playing a Historic Brawl deck, and you really want to clone, and you're okay with only cloning artifacts, and you're in a color combination that is not blue, so you don't get the better clones, then this is fine. Like, it's a fun card. Being able to copy your opponent's biggest artifact or your biggest artifact, your Wormcoil or whatever, does seem like it could be pretty impactful. So Sculpting Seal, I think it's another C card. I don't expect to see it a lot, but in the right shell, it could be fine. We also got Self-Assembler, already on Arena, also pretty bad. Semblance Anvil, another pretty sweet combo piece. It's essentially a Heartless summoning, with the downside that you have to exile a card from your hand to imprint on it to be able to get value out of it. But the upside that you can exile any permanent type from your hand. So this can be a 2-mana cost reduction to creatures or artifacts, to instants or sorceries. So Semblance Anvil, it's essentially a combo piece. Don't make the mistake of playing this card for value. However, if you have combos that can go off, go infinite because your stuff costs 2 less, then Semblance Anvil is worth it. So narrow circumstances where it's good, but in those circumstances, it's a unique card that really doesn't have many replacements in Magic. We also got Sigil of Valor. I'm going to put it in the D tier. I've actually never seen anyone play this card. It is new to Arena, so that's notable. Maybe some token deck could take advantage of it, but I have literally never seen it work in any format. Soul Guide Lantern, already on Arena. Springleaf Drum. This is another card I'm really excited for. This card shows up in Modern, in Affinity style decks. We have a lot of Affinity pieces on Arena. We have the Thought Monitors, we have Affinity cards, we got Artifact lands. I think this is S tier. I think this is a huge, huge boost to power for Affinity style decks in Historic. And if you're playing an artifact deck in Historic Brawl, it's pretty good there as well, because you can make a mana out of it by tapping a creature. It's essentially another free artifact. So if the goal of your deck is just get as many artifacts on the battlefield to support Affinity for artifact spells or other artifact synergies, it's really, really good at that job. We also have Staff of Domination. Staff of Domination, way too expensive for most decks, but it's one of the best infinite mana payoffs that we have in all of Magic. If you can make infinite mana, this does literally everything. It wins you the game. It draws you your deck. It does everything you could possibly want it to do. There are some infinite mana combos on Arena, and maybe more now that we have Ashnod's Altar. We were talking about like Ashnod's Altar with Pitiless Plunder and Resembling Skeleton. So in those shells, I could see this being a good finisher. I guess you could also just play it in some sort of artifact ramp style commander deck for value, but in general, playing it for value usually doesn't work out because it is pretty expensive if you don't have infinite mana. So we're going to put it in the B tier as an infinite mana payoff, but otherwise, probably not going to make the cut. We also got Sundering Titan, which is a card I actually wonder about if they're going to let this be allowed in Historic Brawl. It's banned in Commander because it can blow up a bunch of your opponent's lands. It can do the same thing in Historic Brawl. This is also a card that shows up in 60 card formats. It's a Karn Wish card out of the sideboard. It shows up in Tron decks sometimes. So we have like artifact ramp decks, like the Forsaken Monument, mostly colorless or mono black ramp style deck. I think Sundering Titan is a great inclusion there because you're only playing one basic type. You're probably blowing up 3 or 4 of your opponent's lands, maybe worst case 1 of yours. So I think Sundering Titan, we'll see if they actually leave it in Historic Brawl. I expect once people get their lands blown up a few times, maybe Wizards actually ends up banning this card, and definitely some potential in 60 card formats as well, which I guess good in Historic Brawl, some play in 60 card formats. I guess by our definitions, that would make it an S tier card. Speaking of S tier cards, this one is only for one format, but it's so impactful, I think it's got to go S tier, and that is Swiftfoot Boots. Swiftfoot Boots, one of the most played commander cards in existence. Just protecting your commander, giving it haste, giving it hexproof. It shows up alongside Lightning Greaves. Those are the 2 big ones. Almost every commander deck is going to play Swiftfoot Boots and or Lightning Greaves as protection for their commander. We don't have either of those cards on Arena until now, so I don't think Swiftfoot Boots will show up in Historic or anything like that, but I do think that almost every Historic Brawl deck is going to play a copy of this card. You really need a reason not to play this card in your Historic Brawl deck. So even though it's only a 1 format card, the fact that it's so impactful in that format is going to show up so often in that format, I think clearly puts it in the S tier. We also got Sword of the Meek. Sword of the Meek, combo piece. Thopter Sword, Sword of the Meek with Thopter Foundry, top tier deck at various times in the modern format. The problem is we don't have Thopter Foundry on Magic Arena, and without the power of Thopter Foundry to go infinite, Sword of the Meek just doesn't really see play. I guess maybe there could be some weird artifact sack deck with a bunch of 1/1s that could play it for value, but in general, it doesn't see play without its best friend Thopter Foundry. So I'm going to put this in the C tier for now, although this is another one to keep in mind. Once we get some historic anthology or master set or something that shows up on Arena and gives us Thopter Foundry, this probably jumps at least to A tier, maybe even to S tier, because that combo would likely be a actual competitive deck in Historic. We also got Thorn of Amethyst. So Thorn of Amethyst, it is literally Thalia, except instead of being on a 2/1 first striking body, it's on a non-creature 2-mana artifact. We talked about this a little bit earlier with the Lodestone Golem deck, where we could possibly play an artifact stack style deck. So I think there's potential main deck homes for this card, alongside Lodestone Golem and Phyrexian Revoker. The other place this card can have value is as a sideboard hate card. If your opponent's playing a Phoenix style deck, trying to cast 3 spells in a turn, or trying to storm off and cast a bunch of spells during a turn, this can be a nice sideboard card that, because it's colorless, you can put in any single deck that is really going to hate on those spell-based combo decks, and is not bad against control either. This is +1 mana to all your counter spells, removal spells, planeswalkers, so I think there's certainly a role here. I'm going to stick it in the B tier alongside Lodestone Golem. Maybe they can make a new deck together in the Historic format. Worst case, a really nice sideboard card. Unwinding Clock untaps all your artifacts on each opponent's untap step. This works in artifact commander decks on occasion, but I think it's a lot worse in Historic Brawl, because again, you only have one opponent in Historic Brawl. In Commander, you got 3 opponents, so every turn cycle, you're untapping your stuff 3 times. In Historic Brawl, you're only untapping it 1 time. If you're playing an artifact deck, maybe that's still worth it. I'll put it in the C tier on the off chance that it is, but it's a card that I don't actually think is going to be that great, even in artifact decks in Historic Brawl. We also got Well of Lost Dreams. Well of Lost Dreams is the best card draw for a life gain based commander deck, and I think that that is going to be its role. If you're trying to play life gain shenanigans in Historic Brawl, this is an auto include. It's going to be one of the most powerful cards in your deck. Sadly, at 4 mana and then X to activate when you gain life, it's just a little bit too much, even for Soul Sisters, I think, in Historic. Although, because Arena players love their life gain deck so much, I wouldn't be surprised to actually see this in Historic. I think some of those Ajani Pridemate life gain players are probably going to throw a copy or 2 in their deck. I don't think it's actually good enough to make the cut from a competitive perspective, but it certainly is in life gain Historic Brawl deck, so we'll throw that in the B tier. And then last but definitely not least, Wormcoil Engine, one of the most exciting cards from this set. Wormcoil, modern playable, commander playable, 6 mana, 6/6, makes 6 power when it dies, death touch and lifelink. It is one of the better creatures that Wizards has ever made, and I think this one has an impact. I think ramp decks will play this in Historic. The colorless ramp decks goes up even more in value if we ever get Tron on Arena, which apparently they're not adding Jumpstart to Arena, which has the Tron lands, but if we ever get Tron on Arena, it gets even better. Plus, it's a fine card that you can throw in literally any Historic Brawl deck. It goes up in value if you got artifact synergies or whatever, but its stats and abilities are just so good that if you just want to have a good threat in the 6-drop slot, it's colorless, so you can play it in literally any deck. So that's our tier list of retro artifacts for Magic Arena from the Brothers War. So you've seen my rankings of these cards. Let me know what you think. What did I get right? What did I get wrong? Did I whiff on anything? Am I underrating, overrating anything? What about the combo pieces we talked about, like Altar of Dementia or Ashnod's Altar? I tried to share some of the combos that I have found and I'm hyped about. Am I missing some obvious one? Is there some obvious combo that's like, no, Ashnod's Altar is actually just absurdly broken and going to be banned? Same with Altar of Dementia. What about the artifact stack deck with Lodestone and Thorn? Can that actually work in a format? Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you want to see some of these cards in action, make sure to check out the rest of the YouTube. I'm sure we'll be trying some of these cards and this stream where we can check them out there as well. So thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you soon.